Do you think I need to wear these headphones, or?
No, it's up to you.
I might not.
Okay. So I'm here with my friend David Lord. David, I was trying to remember. I know we met in L.A.
Yes.
You're from Wichita.
Right.
Still live there.
Right.
And we met at, was it Pear Space before it was Pear Space? Or
I think was it called Timber Space?
Timber Space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And this is with your old band Soliget.
Correct. 2005, I think.
Okay. So 14 years ago.
Right.
And Soliget was kind of was like two brothers, rhythm section?
Two twin brothers, identical twin brothers.
Okay, and you guys were like touring in a school bus?
Yeah, we had a short bus that we had bought, purple and white. I think it was a K-State. The colors of K-State were purple and white.
Okay.
So it was like a, I don't know, tailgating bus that we bought and turned into our tour bus.
So you were living sort of like the Midwestern musician's dream. You come out to Los Angeles in your school bus to play your jazz fusion.
Right, trying to, this is before we had any GPS or anything, so we had these big maps, like going 20 miles under the speed limit in LA, missing our turns and trying to find, this big long 3-week West Coast tour in these big cities. I think back, I don't even know how we quite did it.
So that ended up coming together, if I'm remembering correctly, because of Adam Hervey or Adam Garcia and their band Timonium.
Correct.
And I was working with Adam Garcia at the time, and I was playing in a band called I Heart Lung, if I recall.
Yes, that's right.
And I think we had maybe just made a record for Asthmatic Kitty called Enter Oceans, which Nels Klein and Dave Easley and Chris Tyner and a few other people are on. We augmented our little duo. But then live, we only ever played as a duo. It was just Tom Steck and I, guitar and drums. And I think maybe did Timonium play this show also, and Soliget?
No, it was, Timonium actually couldn't play for some reason. It was Castanets.
Oh, okay. So maybe this was like a tour thing with Castanets. Maybe this might have been the beginning of a tour that I went on.
Are they not from around here?
No, they were from San Diego at the time.
Oh, okay.
So this was 2005?
I'm pretty sure.
Oh, shit. Now, I don't know. It's all coming back to me. Because we did a U.S. tour with them in 2005 with Wooden Wand and The Vanishing Voice as well. So like a 3-band U.S. tour.
Okay. They might have played the show. I don't really.
I think remember. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because all these memories I don't think about this stuff at all. I just think about like today or tomorrow.
Yeah, same here.
But it's interesting to kind of like remember how you and I met each other.
Right.
And then how all these years later we kept in touch. And I would come through Wichita or in and around Kansas.
Right.
And we would play shows together. And then the next thing you know, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I came through with Psychic Temple. And you essentially asked me, so what's it like to work with Chad Taylor?
Exactly.
And I said, well, you could work with Chad Taylor. He's for hire. He's a professional, He can play with you or Pharoah Sanders or,
I said, but I'm from Wichita. Are you sure I can work with you?
Yeah.
Chad Taylor.
Yeah. And so then I think we started sort of like hatching that idea. And then I reached out to Chad, and then I think maybe Devin Hoff as well. And then eventually we put some dates on the calendar. You flew out here from Wichita, and we spent 2 days.
Yeah, first record. Yeah, there's just 2 days. That's right.
Working on Forest Standards Volume 1, which Big Ego eventually released at the end of 2018. So you're really your first kind of like record as a leader of like your compositions played with essentially, for the most part, a trio, like a power trio.
Right.
What was that whole process like for you? I remember at the end of it, you told me something to the effect of, you felt like you went to music school.
Yeah, it was like a graduate degree or something.
Yeah.
Just because, I've got to play with some great musicians throughout the years, but nothing like Chad Taylor and Devin Hoff. I've been listening to Chad Taylor since I was in high school. All his work.
Sam Prekop and
Sam Prekop was where I
Underground.
Chicago Underground, his stuff with Jeff Parker, and he, for years when I put together little jazz, I don't want to call it jazz, but little trios that kind of resemble this type of music, I would play for them. The drummer I'd be playing with maybe would be playing something more kind of a standard approach to swing or something like that, and I would say, well, have you heard of Chad Taylor? And then I'd play for them Chad Taylor and say,
right.
This is kind of the vibe I'm going for. So there was a whole handful of drummers that I said,
play like
Chad Taylor.
Right.
So obviously to get to play with them, to play with Chad, and I remember when he walked in the first time, it was just surreal. I'm sure you've had plenty of experiences like that, very surreal. But and then Devin, I didn't know his name at first, but I had actually heard a bunch of records that he was on, like with
all the Nils Klein singers,
Nils Klein and Mary Halverson. There's a record, that I listened to a lot. So. And there's just so many little subtle things those guys did that just sort of blew my mind. I mean, Devin's sense of time. That's one thing that I feel like, not that he imparted that, not that I can do that, but it just, to play with that sort of his type of deep power and rooted sense of time. Had a big that sort of felt like I got to go study with somebody or something, just to be in the same room with him, and same with Chad.
Hoff is one of those guys to me that every time I hear him play, I feel like I'm hearing one of the best musicians in the world. There's just, I don't know that I've ever heard him do anything that was less than like mind blowing, and to sort of keep up that level of musicianship to that degree, I think there are legitimate like geniuses in our midst, but there are plenty more people that are called geniuses and who aren't.
Yeah,
he is.
Yeah,
he's a genius. I think the same for Chad.
Yeah,
to kind of basically to give a little bit of context. So your record is it's augmented with vibraphone and a few other things. I played a little bit of guitar here and there, but for the most part, it's a guitar trio record with you on electric guitar, some nylon string, but Hoff on double bass, Chad on drums. In order to kind of like help make your session happen, what I did was, because we had to fly Chad out, I put a week straight together of sessions, and during that week it was your record for 2 days, and then Eamon Fogarty's record for 2 days, where Hoff and Chad were the rhythm section for that as well, and then one of the days of Anthony Shattuck's double quartet record, where Chad played drums.
Oh,
so
that's right.
So the interesting thing is we ended up releasing your record and Anthony's record in August of last year on Big Ego, and they were actually like recorded the same week. So your record was done at the beginning of the week, and Shattuck's was done at the end of the week. But it's fascinating for me to like think of the context of the time of like a week of time, and you have these three very distinct records that came out of that week for three different artists with a lot of the same musicians kind of below the surface. So the process for us was we recorded for 2 days. And I don't know that I necessarily told you this at the time, but my kind of takeaway from those 2 days was I knew that we were getting good tones, and I knew that like some of the playing was like grooving, but I have to admit that I didn't understand the full context of like what you were doing because you have this polychordal kind of like framework that you put together where you're playing multiple chord voicings on top of each other and creating like a much more dense harmonic framework than I think you would normally hear in even jazz, right? So the interesting thing is that during the time of the recording, you're only playing like one of those things.
Yeah, right.
Because there's just one
layer.
of you.
Uh-huh.
So what we're getting is one layer and then double bass and drums. And then I gave you those files. You went back to Wichita and then did, a little avalanche of guitar and vibraphone recordings there. Then sent it back to me to mix, and only at that point did I understand the full scope of what we were doing. What always blows me away about thinking about that record is how Hoff and Chad were able to suspend their imaginations, because I may be wrong, but I had the feeling that even they didn't completely understand. How could they, right? Like,
yeah, well,
you have all this stuff in your head, but like, we're only hearing like one, let's say a quarter of the harmonic, concepts that you're playing with on the finished record.
Right. And some of the stuff I would tell them, okay, you're not going to hear this part, but... I
remember that.
Yeah, and even I remember there was a few places I even would write out a few rhythmic values that they weren't hearing, but just to tell them that this will be there or whatever.
Right.
Some of it, especially Chad, but both of them, when you listen back, it feels like some weird psychic stuff going on. Chad's amazing because... So on some of those tunes, like it was the first time, I think Hedgehog Mushroom, I think the take we kept was the first time they had ever tried playing it.
Right.
And I still don't know if they listened to the demos I sent them. Because I did send demos that had the full compositions more or less there. I don't feel like they actually, I don't know if they listened to them. If I had to bet money, I'd probably say no, or maybe barely.
Yeah.
But still.
But, I mean, they're running down the charts that you wrote, in real time. And then it's like, sometimes it was like the first or second time they did it was like, that's it.
Yeah, we could just feel it. And several things, like for one, there's several points where they're interacting with a part, or they line up directly with a part that they weren't actually hearing, but it just happened to, like, there's a part like on Devin's solo on Beautiful Bulbitius where he's playing right in line with the classical guitars, but that wasn't there. So it's kind of like, what the heck? But Chad is just so intuitive with compositions. Like, we didn't even really talk about it, but he knew, he could just kind of feel where the song was going to go and switch to like a different, and that's what I love about him is how compositional his drumming is. But Hedgehog's a perfect example. At the end he switches over to that tom sort of groove or whatever, and see, that time he did it, he had never heard the song before, so how did he know that was coming? I asked him about that. He said, if it was a good song, then I feel like I know where it's supposed to go or whatever.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, but this stuff is not normal. I mean, I don't know how he would anticipate that stuff. So there is definitely an energy going on there. But and on the volume 2, there's a few times there too where Chad lines up directly with some classical guitar parts. And that's just like the magic of working at Big Ego, I suppose. Just stuff like that happens, But yeah, that is an interesting thing of doing this. Is just telling them, and when I do the compositions, I try to make sure that with their charts, what they're going to do is going to fit with the whole composition. So harmonically and that type of thing, keep it.
I mean, one thing that I almost feel like would be helpful for maybe somebody who has the record or wants to check out the record, to maybe understand a little bit more about like your process in writing or composing. maybe a good place to get your foot in the door is understanding. And I don't want to have you give away too much because I know you're kind of.
So I was going to ask, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you want me to give away here?
Yeah, I would say maybe
be
a
here
5
for a while.
Maybe.
Okay.
But I feel like a good way for the average person to maybe get their foot in the door is your approach to some of the jazz standards on the record. I feel like that, when I produce a record, quite often I'll kind of like try to talk to the artist at some point, depending on like how much material they have, and say, hey, listen, I think let's try working on a cover or two, because we can do something interesting with it, but it's also a bit of a way to get your foot in the door with people saying like, oh, I know that song. I like that song. I wonder what they did with that song. And I think the interesting thing about your record is you sort of did that already, because you're playing with the concept of a jazz standard, where you're playing with the form. So like I know that like Dear Stockholm is on there. Giant Steps is Gnome Steps. And I'm curious, like, if you could sort of maybe give a little bit of insight into like the way that you treated those songs, because if I remember correctly, you basically told Chad and Devin to play it like it was straight.
Especially Devin. Usually what I do is I use the bass player.
Play the original chart almost.
That's all I gave him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just gave him Dear Old Stockholm from the real book.
Yeah.
Not Gnome, Giant Steps from the real book.
And then we just slowed it down.
Slowed it down, and then it's just like, to me, I wrote a lot of those almost as etudes to kind of work out my harmonic system, I guess. So, I mean, over the last however many years, I've kind of collected just a big database of chord voicings, mostly using open strings. So, honestly, like what I'll do a lot of times, that's what I'm wondering. How much should I get into this? Because this could take up the whole thing. People stop it real quick, so I have this big chord database. What I did was I did photocopies of all of them, all my chords, and then I cut them all up and put them in a big bag. So then I can just pull out of my bag, and then the universe just kind of gives me some stuff to work with, right? And so then I'll have the chord changes for the bass, and then I kind of have a set of harmonic rules that I try to not break. So, for example, over a D minor, I won't get into all the rules, but there's certain chord tones that I can't use over that, and there's a bunch that I can.
Like relationships to that.
Yeah.
Okay, to that chord.
Yeah, and so I've kind of set up my own little system, which is, I'm not saying, it's probably nothing different than a lot of people use, but anyway, just an organizing system for myself as to what I can use over what. Then I'm dealing with all these random chords and finding out where they'll fit over, the standard. So it starts with the B major chord, and then I pull out like a big A major 7/6 sharp 11 flat 9 chord or something like that, right. And then I'll think, okay, well, if the bass player's playing a B major over that, that'll work, right? But
Will it? I don't know.
Yeah. So what happens then is it turns it upside down because then I'll make my composition make sense with the melody and everything, but then it sounds like the bass player's playing all the weird notes.
Right.
So it kind of throws the bass player under the bus, right. Like, what is that guy doing down there? The bass player's playing the wrong chords or whatever.
Right.
But that's the sound I like. I like that disconnect of the bass player is playing more chord tones over what I'm doing rather than just hitting roots with me all the time.
So let me ask you, why did you do this? Did you do it because you were bored with, like, did you feel like you got to a kind of logical end of like what you learned about jazz theory or jazz guitar or harmonic, relationships in modern music, and then at a certain point you were like, all right, fuck it, I want to blow it up and try my own thing?
Kind of, but I was very lucky in college that I had an amazing, especially looking back and realizing now, like, how unique of a guitar teacher he was, if you even call it guitar teacher. And so when I went to him, I think I was a junior, and it was actually a different university, but I started studying with him in addition to where I was going to school, and his name's Craig Owens, and we played All the Things You Are, and I told him, okay, I'm getting nothing but kind of like, just sort of praise, but not any real critique, like from my other experiences, in school and stuff. So I want you to be brutally honest with me, And so we played All the Things You Are, and he's not going to like hearing this because whenever I told this story, but he told me, okay, everything you're doing now, you should stop doing.
Everything.
Yeah, and it was the best piece of advice I ever got, because then it kind of blew open my mind, like, and then, to him, to approach the jazz tradition means to create your own language.
Right.
And that's really what it's all about historically.
But so few people do that
Not
nowadays.
Anymore. It used to be every single person, and every single person.
Every record or series of records was an extrapolation of that concept, right?
Yeah.
Like, here's the new thing that I've come up with since the last record.
Right.
And nowadays it's just like, oh, well, now I do a jazz record with electronics. Oh, and now I do a jazz record with a different band.
Yeah.
Now I do a standards record.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, oh, but we're not really getting a kind of like this kind of deep down, who are you as an artist? What's your harmonic sensibility? What's your melodic sensibility? What's your voice?
And it felt like they were like scientists almost, like doing their work and their research and then presenting it with each album and developing
and
kind of their systems.
Right?
Yeah. But everybody did their own thing, and that's to me the spirit of what people call jazz or whatever, is that sort of like always pushing your own creativity and your own concepts. So after he told me to quit doing what I'm doing, that's what he started presenting me with, was like, you need to create your own concepts. Like, that's what this is all about, And so I started, doing that. And even the band you brought up before, Solaget, like the first song I ever really wrote, I played in rock bands when I was a kid, but then I kind of quit to try to study jazz and learn jazz vocabulary and all that stuff. Then the first song I started to write, which would be kind of the beginning of what I'm doing now, was a Solaget song called The Discovery, but that was an assignment from him to write a melody and bring it back next week. And so anyway, through studying with him, I started trying to identify, because he told me, like, just dream, like, what would your sound be like? What would you imagine in your head?
It's so important to have people like that in your life, because it almost feels like they give you permission to be you.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And it's like, and don't worry if you can do it or not. You could imagine having an orchestra. Don't put any limitations. Just like, what would your sound be like? And right when he said that, I pretty much could see it, and which is really what I'm doing now. It took me a while to, of working on it, but I feel like intuitively I kind of had this really abstract but clear vision of what I wanted to do. So then I started the process of kind of identifying the types of sounds, types of chords I like, and I was really read the George Russell Lydian chromatic concept around that time, and started thinking about kind of philosophically about the Lydian scale and the Lydian system, and so sort of centered my whole thing around the Lydian system and started coming up with chord voicings and cataloging them, and I treated it kind of like it's like documenting these experiments and just trying to find some stuff, and then that was probably in about 2002 or something like that. So since then I always am working on it. Yeah, and so I've even with soloing concepts, I'll take kind of these chord voicings, convert them into arpeggios and soloing melodic devices, and it all kind of comes from that project, I guess. And it just developed, but some of these songs, like even that song Light on the album, I actually wrote that during that time period. It was a really early piece.
Wow.
And that's why I kind of wanted to include it, because this felt like the first time I'm really trying to present this music, because I got kind of a little caught up in putting out kind of indie rock type stuff just because there was a scene for it, you know what I mean? And so since I was putting this album out with these amazing players under my own name and all that, I wanted to kind of almost start with some of the first compositions I did in this style, and then mix it with some newer stuff.
It's interesting to hear you talk, and I know we've talked in the past a little bit more about kind of like the theoretical side of what you're doing. And I've always felt like that's been such a huge deficiency for me, You know, like I faked my way through like playing clarinet, like in elementary school and junior high school. I'm like at Dodger Stadium with an orchestra, and I can't read a note. You know what I mean? I just like stood there with like my, you know, clarinet in my mouth, just like, you know. And it's interesting because for me, I always just came from like music and sound first. You know, I was really like, I was really just having different people's brains work in different ways, right. You know, and the things that you're drawn toward. And I think kind of early on when I was sort of like thinking, when I was in high school, I was sort of like semi-recruited by Berklee College of Music to go out there. And I was just like, you know, I started looking into it. At the time, I was playing in like my school gospel choir, and I was doing like gangster rap sessions for, you know, groups in Long Beach and stuff. And I was playing almost every day. I was still learning. I was a baby, you know, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was doing music, and like that's all I cared about, you know. But I think around that time, maybe a few years later after I graduated, I ended up reading this musician magazine interview with Herbie Hancock and Wynton Marsalis. And they were playing them both like records and sort of like getting their take on it. You know, like, what do you guys think about this? And they played them like Parliament, you know, Funkadelic. And Wynton immediately was like, this is trash music, you know, this is garbage. And Herbie immediately jumps in and he's like, man, what are you talking about? Like, this is music.
That makes sense.
You know, it was this really like, it was so great to, you know, to just even hear or read two great musicians argue. Because there shouldn't be a monolithic point of view, right? Like, that's part of what makes music and art so great. It's like everybody should have their own angle, you know? But what I got out of that was kind of what Herbie followed up with, which was he said, sometimes I wish that I hadn't had all the training and the schooling because it's really hindered my creative process because I think about rules instead of creativity. Yeah. And the funny thing for me is I've come from that in the opposite regard, you know. I'm just thinking about creativity first. Yeah. And then I start having to contend with the theory. And the only reason I ever got to have to contend with the theory was because I had to be able to communicate with musicians because I was producing records or I needed them to play on a record with one of my own compositions. Well, how do I explain to them, how do we save time, right? A good musician, I remember like early on I was playing with Anthony Shattuck, and I don't know if he gave an interview or if he was just telling me this or something. He was telling somebody else, and he said something like, oh yeah, like Schlarb wouldn't know the difference between a Neapolitan chord and Neapolitan ice cream. And I was just like, okay, I think Neapolitan ice cream is just like strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate. That's all I know. But the thing is, I remembered, I know he was joking and it was funny, but I didn't know what a Neapolitan chord was. And so I looked it up and I was like, well, who the fuck needs to know what that is?
Yeah, I've sort of forgotten, honestly. Like, that's a little...
But I took it as like, okay, at the very least, I need to start being able to meet musicians in the middle, right? I don't need to know everything they know. But I do need to be able to like articulate some things clearly in order to sort of like to be the straight line between what I hear and what I want and what I desire and what we can do together, you know? So it's always been interesting to me to end up working with people like yourself who have like such a, I mean, like in some ways like a theoretical grasp of things that I couldn't even imagine. But we end up working together and it's extraordinarily complementary. I mean, we've done 2 records now in the last year and a half or 2 years, and I feel like they've been just a breeze. It almost felt like that we didn't even have to discuss things, right? It was just kind of like, oh yeah, we do this and you do that, and we don't even have to like articulate things. It's just been so telepathic. Yeah. And that process makes me feel like, okay, well, I still want to learn. I still have a lot to learn, but at the very least, I feel like I did my best to try to help pull a very human sounding record from something that was kind of like heavily rooted in the theory.
Right.
And normally what I hear in a lot of jazz records nowadays is a kind of exercise in theory or speed or whatever. And the great thing about, your record is that I don't hear those things at all. It does what I think Steely Dan does really well, which is people hear it on the radio, they sing along, and they have no idea what they're singing about or how complicated the melody or harmony is that they're engaged in. It is a passive enjoyment. But for anybody who cares, who wants to know, it's an active one as well. Do you feel like your music kind of does it do that for you when you listen back to it?
Yeah, and I don't know how intentional it was, but it's just kind of coming from my influences, because